I'm a Waka Waka woman who was born on the land of the Barma people in the place now called Cairns, and who has grown up and now resides in Gubbi Gubbi country in the place now called Redcliffe, just north of Turrbal, Yuggera and Jaggera country in the place now called Brisbane. And Waka Waka country is just to the west of Gubbi Gubbi country. And I am an Aboriginal Christian leader. Before I begin this acknowledgement of country, I remind, or for some of you, I'll be teaching you, that an acknowledgement of country is about acknowledging diverse groups of peoples from over 300 nations, over 600 languages, the world's oldest living culture. I also say an acknowledgement of country for me is a prayer to our Almighty Creator who placed us here as Aboriginal peoples, as His custodians. An acknowledgement of country is more than just words. It's about heart and mind coming together through a genuine want and act of building relationship with Aboriginal peoples. Let us acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, gather, yarn, pray and dream. The Kaurna peoples. They are stewards on behalf of our Almighty Creator. The role of custodian, steward, caretaker is one the Kaurna peoples have undertaken for millennia, although it's been a difficult journey at times. Over 60,000 years, over 2,000 generations of people caring for this land, its waters, all life within it, all peoples. Let me remind us, and these clapsticks remind us, that beneath the concrete and the bitumen, this land holds many stories, all the ceremonies and celebrations it has seen and heard and been present to since the beginning of time. We pay our respects to those elders past, present and future. We thank the elders for the way in which they continue to refresh, revitalise and maintain culture. I think of the elders from many different nations in my life, both past and present, all that they have taught me and will continue to teach me, and I say thank you to them. I also acknowledge Aboriginal Christian leaders that have played an important part in my life and have been friends to surrender as well. The likes of Auntie Jean Phillips, Uncle Graham Paulson, Auntie Iris Paulson, Uncle Ray Minicon, Auntie Denise Champion, Uncle Clyde Rigney and Auntie Rose Rigney. And I say thank you to them for the way in which they have taught me how my Aboriginality and my Christianity are one and the same, and have taught me to fight for justice as Jesus does in this land that we now call Australia. As Aboriginal peoples, we have a strong spirit of survival, over 60,000 years of stories and culture. We are a gift to this country. We are a gift to this world. Sometimes we are still waiting for that gift to be embraced. May we pause today to remember and to pray about how we can further build friendship with one another and build the Australia that I dream of, an Australia built on truth, justice, love and hope. So, love God, love your neighbour, love your enemy. Jesus' 3 mandates to love. What does this look like in the Australian context for us as a nation, us as the Australian Church, and us as individual Australians? Can we see that not only our world, but indeed Australia, is marked by division and conflict, isolation and loneliness, injustice and oppression? Is the Church and are we loving God, loving our neighbour, and loving our enemy? What would it look like for our country to tell an alternative story and to find unity in love? Many questions. And those of you that know me know that when I speak, I like to ask the audience some questions. So I have a bit of a random question for you this morning. So I'll say what the question is so you can start to think about it, and then I'm going to ask you to stand up for which one that you want to vote for effectively. So the question that I have is, do you prefer sunrise or do you prefer sunset, or do you love both sunrise and sunset equally? So those of you that prefer sunrise, I want you to stand up. Oh. All right, thank you. Yeah. Those of you that prefer sunset, you can stand up or put your hand up. Thank you. And those of you that love both sunrise and sunset equally, thank you. And there is, of course, no right answer. And my personal answer is that I do actually love them equally the same, but both for different reasons. Sunrises and sunsets mean a lot to me. When I look at the mess, the chaos, the ruins that our country and our world are in, sometimes the sunrise and sunset is all that we can rely on to happen consistently each and every day. And beauty radiates out of each one. And I love paintings, and each sunrise and sunset I see feels like you are looking at God's canvas. The Bible talks about rainbows being God's promises, and I love that image. I love rainbows too. But for me, I see God's promises twice a day, every day, in the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun. And you see our land that we now call Australia is in a mess, in chaos and in ruins. We are not loving God, not loving our neighbour, not loving our enemy as well as we should. Many Australians don't see this. As Aboriginal peoples, we can't escape this. We feel it under our feet as we walk this ancient and sacred land. We feel it in our hearts as we suffer racism and are treated without human dignity. We feel it in our minds as we battle systems that are designed for us to suffer injustice, systemic injustice. In each sunset, I reflect on the end of another day, with the sun setting on another day which has been filled with grief, frustration, tiredness, even exhaustion. This past year, past month, past week, people have checked in with me and asked, "Brooke, how are you going as an Aboriginal Christian leader?" And my response has been this: I'm tired. I'm so tired. I'm so tired of this country. This past year, we have had to battle to protect Aboriginal peoples from being moved from their homelands through the SOS Black Australia campaign, fighting for our country to uphold the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, fighting against this country's culture of forgetfulness, the Great Australian Silence, where not only 200 years ago did this country remove Aboriginal peoples from their lands, their countries, their connection to culture and language, going back over 60,000 years. But we think of one example, although there are many right across this country, like of 1963 and the forced removal of Aboriginal peoples, indeed Christians, from Old Marpoon in Western Cape York. And here again in 2015 and 2016, we are still fighting to remain on our homelands, still fighting against dispossession, a fight that we've had for over 200 years. This past 6 months, we've had to battle against nuclear waste dump being put on Undermutna country in the Flinders Ranges, a place so sacred where dreaming stories that have been handed down over 2,000 generations are still told in language, part of our culture that is so special and must be preserved, but we fight our state and national governments against greed and profit to protect God's creation, to protect the health of the land, to protect the health of our peoples, a fight that we've had for over 200 years. This past month, we've had to fight for the dignity of our children. We've had to say that torture of Australian children, of mainly Aboriginal children, in onshore detention centres is not acceptable. Our precious, precious children. We saw it play out on our TV screens as we watched Four Corners and the treatment of Aboriginal boys in the Dondale Detention Centre. For us as Aboriginal peoples, we have seen it in our families for many years, in all states and territories. We have spoken out against it, but no one was listening. Fighting for our voice to be heard, listened to, loved. Fighting for our country to uphold the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child. Fighting for our country to uphold our human rights, a fight that we've had for over 200 years. This past week, we've had to fight the mainstream media, the police, the apparent justice system, as we watched, read and heard about what the mainstream media called a riot. but what we know as an injustice, and that the real story was about the murder of a 14-year-old boy, a child who happened to be Aboriginal. A fight for the truth, a fight that we've had for over 200 years. And then the other fights that we have each and every day, fighting against Aboriginal people having the highest rates of suicide in the world, the highest rate of child suicide in the world, the highest rates of prison incarceration, the highest rates of dying too young. We're still in 2016, we have a life expectancy gap of 11 to 17 years. The highest rates of child removals, the new stolen generation. The fact that as Aboriginal peoples we are 5 times more likely to be unemployed, 14 times more likely to be homeless, 6 times more likely to die from diabetes in this country. Deaths in custody that continue to rise with no answers for Aboriginal families and no one held to account. Inquests that take over 3 years to complete when CCTV footage exists, but it is not released and never shown. And even after a Royal Commission in 1991, where 339 recommendations were handed down, but this country chose only to implement a handful. We fight the lack of recognition of the frontier wars, the destruction of sacred sites, for the truth to be told of slavery, massacres, genocide. So much sadness, grief, righteous anger, or as Stan Grant said, the Australian dream. It's enough to make you scream, enough is enough. And believe me, I have been on my knees crying out to Jesus, enough is enough, as have many Aboriginal peoples. Crying out for justice, crying out for our nation, crying out for love. Hope seems hard to find when we know our land is in ruins, in chaos, in a mess. But we haven't lost hope. So whilst the sun sets to grief, frustration and tiredness, the sunrise brings us change. So the next morning as the sun rises, it's filled with such hope, such promise, such a reminder that God is with us. That God's promises of truth, justice, love and hope ring out from the heavens through that painting that is the sunrise. There was one morning as I was thinking about this theme of love God, love neighbour, love enemy, and I was driving to work and watching the sunrise over the beautiful country where I live, Gubbi Gubbi country. And as in that part of the world, in Gubbi Gubbi country, the sun rises over the ocean. And I looked out over the ocean and the sun's rays gently licked the calm, still, silent waters. And I thought about how below the surface of the waters, the sea is full of life, but that life can be so fragile. And I thought about love God, and this image came to mind. This painting is titled On Eagle's Wings and was painted by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Christian leader Safina Stewart. I actually own the painting, which is very special. And this image will be used in TIR's useful gift catalogue to support the work of TIR Australia through the Dumba program this year. And in this image, I see the sunrise and sunset that I've been talking about. Through the use of the colours, I also see me in this picture. But what Safina has painted is Creator God, Holy Spirit, Great Creator Spirit. She's painted how we as Aboriginal peoples see Creator Spirit. Safina chose Exodus 19 verse 4 to go with this message. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. The eagle is a significant totem to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, often symbolising the powerful spirit who created all things. And these are Safina's words that I'm sharing with you. Spraying out of the eagle's wings are the mountains, rivers, sacred sites and communities of people that reflect their creator. The yellow background represents the heat of God's refining fire, love and holiness. We remember the unique and significant role God has bestowed upon our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as custodians and leaders of Australia. So for me, here in this painting, this image, this message is love God. As Aboriginal peoples, we've been doing it for over 60,000 years. Loving God is about loving all God's creation, all peoples, all trees, all plants, all animals, all land, all mountains, all rivers, all seas, all life. Our role as custodians, stewards, caretakers is part of our sacred spirituality. It is something we try to share with the rest of Australia as the world's oldest living culture. A peoples whom God placed here as his custodians. A peoples whom are part of God's miracle. When you look at the effects of stolen land, stolen children, stolen wages. When you look at the true history of this country, how Aboriginal peoples were treated as flora and fauna and even classified as such in legislation. It is God's miracle that we survived. He has loved us for over 60,000 years. Unfortunately, successive governments, some non-Aboriginal peoples, and even the church structures in this nation have not loved us as God has. They have not loved their neighbour. And who is their neighbour? And in that I think about love your neighbour. And it's us. I have another image. In this image, I see the sunrise and sunset that I've been talking about. I think about how for 60,000 years, Aboriginal peoples have watched the sunrise and sunset. Over 300 nations of people. But we are more than just your neighbour. We are your brother and sister. We are your friend. But so often we are treated as strangers in our own country. So often we are stepped over in order for people to reach their overseas neighbour. So often we become invisible. When we look at this world where so many wars are fought each and every day, where there is conflict with our neighbours, where those living side by side each other even want to build walls to stop their neighbours getting in, we look at this map. Over 300 nations once coexisting side by side one another, each people group with their own history, culture and language. A time before we even needed the word reconciliation. What we could have learnt as a world about respect, love and coexistence from this picture is something we will ever know. But what we do know is that elements of it still exist. We can still learn from Aboriginal peoples. The way that we do community and family, the way we love our aunties, uncles, brothers, sisters, cousins, cousin brothers, cousin sisters. Our neighbours is something non-Aboriginal peoples and particularly the church can learn from us, if you are willing. But sadly, we are often treated like the enemy. We are not loved, not respected, not learned from. That day I was talking about where I was driving to work and watching the sunrise, I was listening to a song, and the words that came out from the speakers were, "I still haven't found what I'm looking for." Yes, those of you that are U2 fans will know these words well. And as I thought about these words, I still haven't found what I'm looking for, I thought about what was it I'm looking for? What am I looking for personally? What am I looking for from this country? What am I looking for from Christians in this country? And I thought about these words, love God, love your neighbour, love your enemy. And the love God, well, that was sort of easy. My peoples have been talking about Creator God for over 60,000 years. Love neighbour, it seemed like another easy one. And then love enemy, and that was a really hard one. And I think about love your enemy. It's been a hard one for me since Surrender first announced it as the theme for 2016. And for me as a Waka Waka woman, I had to think about what does love enemy mean? For me as an Australian, I had to think about what does love enemy mean? And for me as a Christian, I had to think about what does love enemy mean? One of the things I was looking for was as Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples where we have not achieved reconciliation in this country, and as a person who continually strives to bring about relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples, what was I looking for? Was who, or indeed what was or is our common enemy? I thought we must have a common enemy because we often do not seem any closer to this seemingly elusive word of reconciliation. Our relationship sometimes feels as far apart as it was in 1788. I think often we can see each other as the enemy, but as Aboriginal people, we feel being the enemy more deeply. When you know how much racism exists in this country, as Uncle Jack Charles is quoted as saying, Aboriginal people suffer a peculiar type of racism, and if you don't know that, I don't know why you don't know that. And we do. You might look at me and go as if she would experience racism. But what happens when you have the skin colour I do is you hear the truth in people's hearts. I suffer a burden that is very deep, as do other Aboriginal peoples, as people may not initially realise that I am Aboriginal, which is racism in itself. And that means I hear their true heart. I hear hate from their mouths. I feel my peoples as the enemy. I hear how my peoples are not seen as individuals worthy of love, but are seen through the false eyes of mainstream media. I see how my peoples can be drawn in racist cartoons in a major newspaper in 2016, and it hurts. It makes me sick. It makes me tired. And you stand here looking at me and you can't see it, but my body bears many scars. All the scars of the racist jokes, the horrendous things people have said, and the worst part are the scars that have been caused by the church and caused by some Christians. They are the ones that cut the deepest. And we often try to hurt our enemies. We just need to look towards Australia's continual progress towards war, where our federal government spends more on defence than on Aboriginal affairs to try and close this gap that we talk about once a year, but a gap that never seems to close. When we scream out for the day that blessed are the peacemakers, when will we make peace in this world and in this country, Australia? This country, this land, this Australia, where Creator God has been screaming out for peace for over 200 years. We have not achieved peace. If we had, we would have achieved reconciliation. We have at times seen each other as the enemy, but God calls us to love our enemy. So we go back to that, I still haven't found what I'm looking for. Part of what I'm looking for is the church that lives out Jesus' mandate to love, the church that really does love God, love neighbour, love enemy. And I still haven't found it. But maybe, just maybe, we capture that glimpse of the kingdom of heaven here on earth, where we can truly love God, love neighbour, love enemy. And we capture that glimpse here at Surrender. It's like that capturing the glimpse of the sunrise or the sunset. In a moment, it can be gone. But the next day, the sun rises and then sets again, and then it rises again and sets again. Consistency. As people, as God's creation, we must live out Jesus' mandate to love with consistency. Here at Surrender Adelaide, I pray you can learn to listen like an Aboriginal person. As Aboriginal peoples, we don't just listen with our ears, but also our eyes, our hearts, our minds, our whole being. It is something very precious. As custodians of this land, as we walk this sacred and ancient land, and as we walk through creation, God's creation, as we think about our dreaming stories, and in the words of Uncle Graham Mundine, Genesis 1 is the greatest Aboriginal dreaming story ever told. We listen with our whole being. Some of you would have heard me that when I take off my shoes, and I encourage you to take off your shoes and feel this land and the ground that you walk on. When I do that and walk this sacred and ancient land, I hear that our land is hurting. I hear that it is weeping. I hear that it is screaming for a better tomorrow. The sound is deafening. My fear is that when non-Aboriginal peoples walk the land, they hear nothing. The great Australian silence. What I don't hear is the deafening sound of us, all of us together, God's people, followers of Jesus, screaming out for that better tomorrow. And that is what we should be hearing. But it means living out reconciliation. It means non-Aboriginal people sitting with us, standing with us, walking alongside us. So over this weekend at Surrender, as you listen to many voices, and Surrender gives us an equal voice as Aboriginal peoples, as you listen with your whole being, and as the sun sets on today and Saturday and Sunday, may you remember that the sun rises the next day. May you remember what it is that we are looking for. And may you be like that sunrise, like a promise of God that will work towards building the kingdom of heaven here on earth, here in Australia. The painting on the screen is a 2016 NAIDOC themed painting by my sister, Waka Waka artist Jasmine Roberts, titled Will You? In this image, I see the sunrise and sunset that I've been talking about, the grief, frustration and tiredness, but also the hope, the promise, the reminder that God is with us. So as we think about loving God, loving our neighbour and loving our enemy, my hope is that you find the strength, encouragement and hope that is in this painting, this image, this message. So as the story that goes with this painting by my sister, will you take my hand? Will you listen to my songs? Will you walk with me? Will you help me find truth? Will you help me seek justice? Will you please, please, please take my hand? Will you take my hand in love? As Aboriginal peoples, we have already forgiven our enemy. Will you come and join me at the foot of the cross? As Aboriginal peoples, we are there at the foot of the cross waiting for you. This painting is actually also a picture of song lines, and music is so important to all of us. So as I come to a conclusion, I come back to the song that played out of those speakers in my car a few weeks ago. And as we currently sing out, I still haven't found what I'm looking for, but more importantly, may we be able to sing out, and yes, I'm still running. May we all run together by loving God, loving our neighbour, and loving our enemy, as we build the kingdom of heaven here in Australia, in an Australia that I dream of, and one that I want us to build together, hand in hand, heart to heart, footstep beside footstep, an Australia that is built on truth, justice, love and hope. This is what it would look like for our country to tell an alternative story, and for our nation to finally find unity in love.